might guess, we have roughly 100 participants today. 100, so odds are quite good that there's someone in the audience today whose birthday it is. I don't know if there's anyone in the audience, and I don't know if there's a better crowd to party with your birthday than we would be, but for sure there's one very special birthday we're celebrating today, and that's the birth of demography, which was born on a cold winter day on February 4, 1662 in London. And that's the reason why today, 4th February, is the European demography. And that's an excellent occasion, not only to celebrate, which we are certainly doing, but also to have a look at the past and the future of demography and what that means for generational issues in the European Union today and in the future. So what we can learn from that. And celebrating is one of the things that benefit from not being only by yourself, but also being with others. So I'm very happy that we have a very knowledgeable party crowd today on the panel with us to discuss on these issues. There is Andreas Edel, who is the Executive Secretary of Population Europe, the leading network of European demographic research institutes. And he's the author of the current biography, and current just means it has just been released a few months ago, on John Graunt, who gave birth to demography. And the title of the book is John Graunt, Plague and Fire, The Man Behind the Numbers. It's in German, and I'm sure you have found the title and the link to the book in the. Is the director of the Federal Institute for Population Research in Germany, in Wiesbaden. And she's of population economics at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz. And last, and certainly not least, but the one with the broadest scope possibly, is Deša Srsen. She's member of the cabinet of the European Commissioner for Intergenerational Equality, Youth, Culture and Sport, Glenn Micallef. And there's me. My name is Elmar Stracke, and I am the producer of the podcast, the German-speaking podcast named Alter, was geht, on the history and the present of age, aging, and demography. And the four of us and all of you, we will spend roughly 1 hour now celebrating the European Day of Demography. So happy European Day of Demography to all of us. Andreas, the occasion why it's today and not any other day is the birth of demography. But that's quite interesting because usually we don't know when a specific scientific discipline has been founded or given birth to. How is it possible that we know that so exactly about demography?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elmar, for this nice introduction. And just to say a short remark before I start, you can also follow simultaneous translations. Sie können also auch Simultanübersetzung auf eine Simultanübersetzung zugreifen. You click on the button on the globe on the bottom of the screen, and then you can also hear the whole event in German. Yeah, so thanks a lot. It's first of all, happy birthday, demography. That was the way how our former director, Jim Appel, every year opened a ceremony on the birth of demography. The idea was actually that demography would have a date when it was founded, even the time when it was born. And it was said that this would be the date and the time when John Graunt presented his natural and political observations on the bills of mortality in London to the Royal Society. And I think these kind of celebrations are always important. Demography is actually a very small, but it's a very innovative and very international discipline. Of course, it's highly relevant also for politics, for society, and for business. Just think about, demographers also work about citizens, newcomers, voters, customers, patients, students, employees, clients, whatever you look into in the future, demographers work on how many and in which composition they are around. And the discipline is often subsumed under sociology, economics, statistics, and so on. It's important to make clear that demography is an own very strong innovative discipline. It's most presumably the oldest empirical social science in the world, and that this goes back to this John Graunt, his publication, Natural and Political Observations in 1662. There was even a picture of John Graunt, which was usually presented at that opportunity. And then there were some doubts. The first doubts came up when we checked into the date, and perhaps you know that in Great Britain, the new calendar, which was invented in the 18th century. So it could be that the time which was given might not be the correct one. So we checked into that. And also the painting the picture was a bit in doubt. It was actually showing someone in the dressing of the 19th century. So there was a lot of doubts. And I was then digging a bit into that and going to an archive. I'm a historian by training. And so I found out that unfortunately nothing of that all was true. So the picture was not John Graunt. It's most likely John Graunt, who worked for Queen Victoria, so much, much later. And secondly, John Graunt didn't present it to the Royal Society. He submitted the bills of mortality, his study, to the Royal Society. And it was not that date. It was actually another date because of this lag between the two calendars. And so at the end of we decided that we would then go for this day, the 4th of February, because that was definitely the day and the anniversary when John Graunt finished his important work. And so then I started to dig more into that, and we don't have much about John Graunt. So his whole property and private property was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. So we only have a few letters. We have only one document. We bought a piece of land. So it was important to reconstruct the life and to better understand why a London haberdasher who sells small textile wares would be the founder of demography, also to some extent epidemiology, public health, so in many ways so influential. And so finally, together with our colleagues from the BEB and from the European Commission, we decided that we should celebrate this birthday on the 4th of February. John Graunt was actually, as I mentioned, a haberdasher, so someone who came actually from a complete different life. He was not supposed to become founder of such an important scientific discipline. He was not supposed actually to be a scholar. He was entering the office, the business of his father in London. And so haberdashers still exist today. At that point in time, they were selling small textile wear for other textile producers, but also other small things. And why did John Graunt come to that idea? And this, I think, is important to understand that the surroundings in which John Graunt lived. So the 17th century London. So this was a time where death was more or less present every day in your life. So in his work, in his observations, John Graunt lists more than 100 different causes of death. So many diseases which we also know today, such cancer, strokes, infectious disease, mental disease even, violent deaths, murder, suicides, everything like that. But the most important reason to die in the 17th century was, of course, the plague, which Graunt in his lifetime survived more than once. So the plague usually came in peaks. And one big peak was in 1625, another one in 1636. And then you may know that in 1665 there was the Great Plague, which was the most violent eruption and of this pandemic in London. But there were many other reasons to die. Of course, violence. This was a time where England, but not only England, also the continent, were almost in every year where there was some war everywhere. And so this was also endangering people's lives. They could also die when you traveled. So, for instance, John Graunt's son, whom we could identify, was an agent of the East India Company, and he died most presumably on a sea travel in the 70s on the way to the factory in Indonesia where he worked for. So you see, it was a lot of reasons to die. And most important was, of course, early childhood risks. Dying in your early lives was very likely. So he himself, John Graunt, had 8 children. 3 were boys, 5 were girls, but only 2 survived to a later age. And so if you think about the mortality, which also often was called the mortality crisis of the 17th century. So there were a lot of reasons to die, as the mortality crisis of the 17th century meant particularly that you had the highest risk to die young, and so death was more or less all and everywhere present. And then there was something, and now we come closer to the observations of John Graunt. We come to the bills of mortality. This was something which was in London, produced in the parishes. So in the parishes, people recorded all the causes of death. So that when someone was buried, there was a person running there, checking, okay, which was the cause of death, writing this down. Then the administration of the parish sent it to the company of all the parishes, and there it was put together into something which was sold on the streets more or less every week. And so these bills of mortality were important. They were really part of the communication culture in London, where people could get informed what is happening in my parish, who is dying for what diseases, and particularly if the plague was starting, then it was an important piece of information, a kind of an early alert system to flee, to leave, to go, and to leave the place and not to be exposed to the risk of an infection. So that's in short a little bit about the background. And because John Graunt found this material, and now comes the interesting thing, he started to make his own thoughts on that, own analysis, to check into that, to see regularities, to apply what he called his shop arithmetics, so his business arithmetics, in order to understand the structure of this material and of the demographic development in that time. And this was a kind of a starting point of demography. And then, of course, you never can take people out of the surroundings where they are. In that period of time, London had a very sparkling and inspiring intellectual atmosphere. Maybe some of you have heard about Francis Bacon, who was the founder and thinker of empirism in that time. So people started not to start explaining the world using the Bible or some other theories, but really to look into what's happening in nature, what is happening in society, and then to say we have to make experiments, we have to make observations. That's why he called it observations, in order to understand what's going on, and then we can go to theories of a higher sort of kind. This was an intellectual climate, so to say. It was a special communication culture in which Graunt was born into, and mortality was all and everywhere present, and that's why he got, of course, the idea to do this kind of work, to do the natural and political observations. Now, the second part of this title, natural and political observations. The political observations shows that demography was always, from the very beginning, a discipline which strongly looked also into political outcomes. So it was Graunt himself understood his study not as being just say la pola or just for the sake of producing something, but as a study which should help decision makers in society, in politics, to understand what's going on in terms of mortality developments, population developments, which also included fertility, it included the overall population, it included movements and migration between London and the countryside. So it was from the very beginning nothing but what was just a theoretical work. Actually, John Graunt was not a great theory guy. It was actually really meant to help policymakers to form better decisions. And that also influenced, and of course, after his study, more work in that direction in London, but also elsewhere. For instance, Colbert, which the French colleagues certainly know, was an important French reformer. He also took that up and invented that in France. It was invented in the Netherlands. It was invented in many other places that people started to say, okay, we need this kind of data and we need this kind of analysis to better understand what's going on in our population and in our society. No, I'm not sure.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for shedding some light on this very long lineage of demography, starting with John Graunt and leading us to the present, to the demographers of today, among which there is Katharina and her Institute for Population Research. And it's very interesting that you already highlighted the intersection between analysis and policy outcomes. which is exactly where you are working at, Katharina. So what would you say are the biggest challenges in translating scientific research from demography, for instance, because this is today's topic, into policy outcomes? And have you noticed any change in that in the past decades?
Thank you very much, Elmar, for this challenging question. I would like to start as somebody working at a federal institute with viel Glück und viel Segen, I would like to say, to demography, to have some German words for demography as well. Coming back to your question, I think it's actually not only the founding, the birthday, you can say, of demography. In a way, it's also a birthday for institutes like we are, as you mentioned it, with the explicit task and invented by policy to have science to advise them. And your question is, what kind of challenge do we have as scientists, as researchers, to give advice to policymakers? And when I think about that, I think there are different aspects which we all might have realized. And the first very simple thing, but often it's not so simple, is we have different languages and communication styles. Researchers and policymakers usually have different frameworks, and as researchers often very precisely and nuanced present their findings, policymakers really seek for a clearness. They seek for actionable insights. This is something what we are not learned to present. Another connected to this is the level of detail we are actually looking at things. Research often presents multiple perspectives and dependencies on issues, while policymakers, they don't want or they don't like if we as researchers say, okay, from this perspective, we would say this, from that perspective, we would say that. And it might be even different. Then policymakers, usually if I talk to them, they say, come on, what is the issue? I need one clear statement. And this is nothing what we as social scientists usually present. This has to do with social science complexity. As social scientists, we are not natural scientists, and therefore we can't for sure predict something. We can't say if we drop a stone that 100% it will fall down, because human beings act in different ways. And so social scientists is very, has to deal with a lot of risk and uncertainties. For example, fertility is even, some people would say, easily to predict, but I would say it's not very easy to predict. As we now see with the pandemic, all prognosis related to fertility, you can put them away because the pandemic changed a lot. Another issue is the different time horizon we have. Policymakers have short-term horizons. We as researchers usually have long-term horizons where we say, okay, if we recommend a particular measure, it could be that this measure will take years to have a result and have the full results. And policymakers can't wait for that. Another way is that usually, which also has to do with complexity, that if you want to describe reality, it's not that you need different perspectives. In a way, you also need different disciplines to look at it. Demography is a discipline which covers, in a way, aspects from sociology, economics, and so on and so forth. And usually, we researchers, we are very much stick to our own discipline. And therefore, I think it's also very important for policymakers to invite various researchers, and that we as researchers should be aware that other colleagues from another discipline also have something important to say, which helps to describe reality, and policymakers have to understand reality. You also asked me what changed in the last 20 years, if we can say that. I think one one very important thing is that since social, empirical and quantitative social sciences has progressed and more people actually study that, more and more people also in the administration and in policy have a better understanding on how to interpret empirical results. So I think this is a positive development, that more and more people from our institutes, PhD students, actually go into the administration and have a very good understanding what actually empirical results tell them and what are the pros and cons of these kind of studies. On the other hand, I think we have, in a way, we have the century of alternative facts. And this is, I think, the opposite of it. There are more people knowing how to interpret empirical results, but on the other hand, there is also a new movement, or actually, unfortunately, it's not so new anymore, this movement in saying, okay, we ignore empirical results. We are more or less ignorant what empirical results tell us. And I think John Graunt, if he wouldn't be dead already, would say, oh my gosh, they don't realize what kind of mortality trends I present them. And therefore, I think this is the other thing, which is also part of our past, that more and more people are tired to have a very differentiated look on empirical issues and say it's not so simple. We sometimes have to go very deep and have to see that we are depending on different definitions, assumptions. We have different results and we can talk about it. And this is what I said, social science is not natural science. It really has to do with human behavior. And therefore, we need to discuss assumptions of models and so on and so forth. Let's make a period here. Sorry.
Thank you very much for this very enthusiastic pitch for demography and its importance. Perhaps maybe a bit later, Deša can let us know what she thinks from the other side of the table, what they would need more from the science part of the table. Do you think there are certain specific lessons from your research, perhaps even from John Graunt's research, that policymakers could overlook, but they're important, and where you might even say, well, okay, this is very obvious, and unfortunately they don't understand, and I'm trying again and again, and it would be so important to have policymakers see this, these data and this information and understand it.
Well, I would say it depends a little bit on what you're focusing on. If we, for instance, talk about intergenerational inequality, if this is an issue and if we want to understand inequality better, which is, I think, a very important issue for nowadays, I think it's, as policymakers have a different time horizon, in my perception, as somebody who works on families and education, policymakers often forget that the foundation for human development is laid in the early years, and that the early years are extremely important for later life events as well. And that if you really try to support people from the very beginning, that you not only save a lot of money later, but that it actually is an insurance for a better development over the life course. And usually policymakers don't focus on early childhood because the effect, if you intervene in early years, comes later, 20 years later, when policymakers are almost already retired. So this is a problem. This is one issue. If we come back to John Graunt and say, okay, what kind of innovative ideas did he had? What should we actually learn from him? I think it's very important that he already discovered that the value of long-term data collection. I'm working at an institute, and myself, we are doing a lot of panel surveys. And panel surveys are surveys which do not only have a cross-sectional view on things, which actually observe people over a longer period, in principle over the entire lifetime. That would be wonderful if we would have so much money, because this tells us a lot. This kind of longitudinal data tells us a lot about differences about reforms, how things change and who's actually responsible for that change. And I think this is what John Graunt obviously already discovered. He also already discovered, I mean, he's not only a demographer, he's also a bit an epidemiologist. So he discovered that the environment and the health determinants of somebody really matter for particular outcomes, namely in mortality. That he, as far as I heard from your wonderful podcast, this is Andreas, Elmar Stracke and Andreas did a wonderful podcast on John Graunt. He also worked on how smog in London actually affected mortality. I think it couldn't be more recent, this topic. We are analyzing now how environmental issues, climate change, actually also affect demographic events like fertility, mortality, and so on and so forth. And what John Graunt also, I think, told us that the interpretation of data is very important, that it's not just presenting the data, put them on the table and say, okay, that's it, goodbye. He actually also talked to politicians and interpreted the data, because I think this is what we also have to do as researchers. We cannot just put tables on the table and say, that's it. We have to talk with people and give some kind of interpretation, and also have to say that there are some limits in the data. And Graunt also somehow, as far as I understood, also pointed to the limitations of his data to say, okay, this is how far I can go with the data, but there I can't say anything else anymore. So this is some thoughts on that. Elmar.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And there was already so many keywords in what you said on intergenerational justice, on life course, on health, etc. All those keywords that are most likely will appear very often in Deșa's everyday work life. The European Commission is one of the co-initiators of the European Day of Demography and is dealing with all these topics. Deša, why do you think it makes sense to have a specific day dedicated to demography, which we are celebrating today?
So thanks a lot for the question. And I think it's good that I'm coming after Andreas and Katharina, because Andreas gave this kind of a historical overview of where we are coming from and why we are here today. And Katharina about this cross-fertilization between science and policy making. So on the side of the Commission, we're not on this historic element. We're very little on the we definitely capitalize on the cross-fertilization between the science and policy. But what we need to do is to have something that is actionable. And you know that demography has become the portfolio on the level of the European Commission only with the first von der Leyen Commission. So we had this experience of 5 years of a portfolio of demography with at the time Vice President Šuica leading the portfolio. And what we were trying to do when it comes to demography is to find elements whereby we can actually infuse different policies on EU level with these demographic considerations. So what is the problem with demography is that it's always important, and we managed to show how important it was on the level of the EU, but it's never urgent somehow, because you always have this impression, you know, that there's time. I mean, these things take a lot of time. So there is always this challenge of keeping demography high on the political agenda and of making sure that it indeed infuses policymaking in a meaningful manner. So not just by inserting references to demography in our different policy proposals and so on. So what we were doing over the last years, we were first of all trying to find what was the EU competence when it comes to demography, because it's not only about, you know, counting birth rates, how many deaths we have, and migration, which are the demographic elements, but it's really about seeing where it is that EU could have a value added when it comes to infusing our policy making with these demographic considerations. So this social dimension is always very, very obvious. What has become very clear on the EU level is that demography is basically first of all about this human capital, about empowering the entirety of the human capital we have for the needs of the labor market, because one of the key elements we have on the EU level is the shrinking of the working age population. But it's also extremely territorial. So when we speak about demography on EU level, the reference in the treaties, in the EU treaties to demography, is on the territorial dimension. So it's this Article 175 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, where we are speaking about helping regions deal with their own demographic handicaps and demographic challenges. So that's why with this new commission, rather than having demography, only demography as a portfolio and not and seeing it as isolated from everything else, the whole purpose is to see a little bit of demography in the different portfolios of other commissioners. So for example, now while having still demography as part of one portfolio, we also have intergenerational fairness. We also have brain drain, which is with another commissioner. We have so many elements of demography that are a little bit everywhere in the commission. And I think it's a lot of value added because it's kind of breaking the silos when it comes to demography, and that's the advantage when it comes to policy making. We need to make sure to infuse the political communications we have, the different initiatives, but also the legislative proposals with this dimension of the need of building the human capital for the needs of the green and digital transitions and everything that we're doing on the level of the European Union. So having identified the key demographic trends that are shaping the future of Europe, which is very much aging and shrinking working age population, we have tried with the demography portfolio to find ways with regards to aging by switching to longevity, and with regards to the shrinking working age population by activating the entirety of the human capital to infuse this policy making with these demographic considerations. And Katharina was very much speaking about this cross-fertilization between science and policy. And I think that we have this joint research center, which is very much part of the commission, and that helps us with data, with projections, and with making sure that we have also established something that is called the Atlas of Demography. So whenever we have a major initiative that's coming up, we kind of screen it through this demographic assessment, and we make sure that it is fully taken into consideration, so that the proposals we are making are fully resilient and are indeed infused by these demographic considerations.
Thank you very much, Deša, to already making a link between the research and the policy outcomes. You're in a virtual audience or a plenary with a lot of demography enthusiasts for whom demography might be an end in itself, but most people expect it as research, as science, to somehow help improving our lives for current and future generations. So what is could you be a bit more specific or concrete on what the European Commission is planning on in terms of intergenerational fairness, in terms of how we can live together in Europe with all these major trends that you've already mentioned?
Yeah, so intergenerational fairness, this is this new portfolio. So we have it in place for 2 months now. It's very new since the 1st of December. And one of the missions of Commissioner Micallef is to present a new strategy, which is a strategy of intergenerational fairness. So why are we even looking into intergenerational fairness? Obviously, it's because we have this demographic change that is happening in Europe. For the first time in the human history, we have so many generations living side by side, and we need to make sure that no generation is a burden to another generation. And on the other hand, we also have this element of longevity, because we have never lived this long, and we need to find ways of capitalizing on the longevity dividend and of making sure that that we somehow make the best out of these additional years we get to live. And the point with this intergenerational fairness is not only to look into fair way of dealing within generations that exist today, but also of making sure that whatever policy decisions we make today do not limit the maneuvering space of the future generations, of the ones that are not born yet. So we are now in this process of a scoping exercise within the Commission. So what we are trying to do is really to define exactly what intergenerational fairness means for different policies that we have on the level of the European Union. And the final objective is to present the strategy in the first months of 2026, which means that we have a full year of consultations in front of us. But the point of this strategy would be that we present a communication accompanied by an action plan, and this action plan would consist of a number of flagships that different commissioners would take the ownership of. So, for example, we have a commissioner for housing. Our ambition would be that he would be rolling a flagship on intergenerational housing platform of the intergenerational fairness strategy. Or, for example, a commissioner in charge of agriculture who would be rolling a flagship on generational renewal in agriculture. Thereby, the whole idea is to completely infuse the decision-making in the Commission by these demographic considerations, by making sure that different commissioners in charge of different portfolios actually take demography as a point of departure of developing the different initiatives that they would be putting forward. And in addition to this action plan and communication, the ambition is very much to come up with some kind of impact assessments that would screen how much our policy proposals or legislative proposals do impact the different generations that are currently living, or potentially the generation that is not born yet. But also to imagine something like an index of fairness, whereby we would identify a certain basket of indicators and try to measure in a very quantitative manner the progress towards achieving the targets that we will have identified in terms of those indicators. So the project is very ambitious. The idea is to consult very widely, starting only with Commission colleagues, but then opening up to kind of the outside world. So first of all, institutions, international organizations, but then NGOs, different stakeholders, obviously experts, but also citizens, which is something that is very interesting as well. And then to come up with a package that we would present early next year, but that would really be a platform for a rolling agenda throughout the next years, whereby different commissioners would indeed be presenting how much this intergenerational dimension is impacting their own work and their own policies.
That sounds actually very ambitious. It's great to hear how much it is up on the agenda, but again, very ambitious, necessary, however. You mentioned a scoping exercise. I think we should also do a scoping exercise now and open the plenary for questions from the audience. If anyone at the screens has a question, please write them in the chat, be brief, and specify who you're addressing from the panel, please. You can also raise your hand, and then we will see how far we get, because we have another 20 minutes roughly. And we already have 2 questions in the chat, which I think I would address mostly to Katharina and Deša. The one is, what will be the best policy for sustainable retirement benefit system by state in countries where the share of aging population is rapidly increasing? And the second question by Mr. Mi Hong is how to apply advanced demographic methods, integrate big data, cloud platforms, and blockchain technologies to accurately adjust and warn of the unfairness and inequality caused by intergenerational choices, which already sounds a bit like the index you've mentioned, Deša, and this assessment. Deša, Katharina, any of you?
May I
Katharina?
start, Deša? Yeah,
Yes.
I can start, and then Deša can go on. Concerning this big questions, retirement issues, how can we, I think this is a very hot topic. And we can say a lot. We can say a lot about how to change the retirement system itself. I won't go in this direction. I would like to follow on what Deša said, because the answer, how to cope with retirement, I think, is exactly in empowering human capital. This is a very nice expression. We are a society where we actually lose and don't make use of all education potentials to start with. We don't make use of all employment potentials. And this is, I think, very, very important, that from the very early on, we actually take everybody on board. We take everybody on board if we talk about children who don't speak German at home, if I refer to Germany, or who don't speak the language of the host country. We can help them to learn language very early. This helps further on that they can perform in school much better. That helps them to get better job. This helps our economy, that the productivity increases, and productivity increases also are very, very helpful for our retirement system, who actually refer to a pay-as-you-go system, which is also partly some people think of if we might change that. So I think everything which is related to empowering human capital, human potential, is helpful for our society, not only in respect to numbers, but also in respect to the productivity, which has to do something economists would call it also the quality of the population, if we can call it that way, which is in a way the education of the population. May I stop here and hand over to Deša?
Deša, please.
Yeah, happy to try to answer the question on pensions first, because you know that when it comes to the European Union, we need to be super extra careful to make sure that we only deal with topics that fall within our competence. So whatever we do in relation to demography, we first make sure that indeed we speak there about European competence. Now, when we speak about intergenerational fairness, knowing that 30% of our population is over 60, the question of pensions is completely inevitable. And one of the key points is always looking into ways of how to alleviate somehow this burden of aging on the budgets, because that's also one of the elements in there. But rather than touching the pensions or looking into pensions, what we are trying to do from the EU level is also look into this idea of flexible retirement patterns. So how do we capitalize on the flexibilities, on the healthy aging, on longevity, by making sure that we introduce these type of flexible retirement patterns. So what I'm trying to say is that while being careful that we stay within, the European competence, we also make sure that we activate the entirety of the human capital we have, and the seniors are part of this entire of the human capital we dispose of, and we capitalize on the flexibilities that are at our disposal to make sure that we keep this competitive edge of Europe, because otherwise by aging and shrinking, we're losing it. And we need to make sure that when it comes to competitiveness, we keep the competitive edge, because that's the whole point of activating the human capital that we have at our disposal.
Deša, can you also say a word on the second question? If in all what you're planning, you're going to integrate big data, cloud, blockchain, technologies to accurately judge the fairness and unfairness caused by inequality, caused by intergenerational choices. Is that something?
Yeah, that part, I actually thought Katharina would be better placed for this part of cross-fertilization.
Yes, please.
I can follow up on you. Or I think I'm not 100% sure what the person who raised the question has in mind. What kind of data are needed actually to warn of unfairness and inequality? There are many, many ways to answer that. I mean, we have already pretty good panel data, and we can ask for more data on measuring inequality in the society, inequality in various dimensions, in respect to income, in respect to employment, in respect to gender equality, and all these kind of things, which we can actually measure with different kind of tools. I think this is something what we have. What we are at our institute, we are even thinking of finding a better measure of inequality in well-being as a measure for different kind of, also again, demographic decisions. If people feel happy, if people are satisfied with their life, they are more productive. We know that they have a higher probability of founding a family. We know that they work longer. So, but well-being is also very unequal distributed over our population. So I think if we have good data in the long run on on objective and also subjective measures, I think these subjective measures are missing, which are important to tell policymakers, okay, we lose people because they're so unsatisfied, and we have other people who are very much satisfied. And I think this is something what policymakers should take more into account, and people feel subjectively unfair treated. And this is what we should also capture in our quantitative data.
Thank you, Katharina. I think it sounds very plausible, actually. I see that Andreas wants to add something before we open up for a new round of questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Just a short nuance which I would like to bring in is that we often talk about intergeneration, transfers, exchange, whatever. We talk about the young and the old. But what we should consider is diversity. So the young can be very different in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds, whether your parents had enough time to care for you, and whether you live in the countryside or you live in a big city. The same holds true for the old age people. You can be healthy and you can be active. You can be enabled by that to work longer, or you can't. You have perhaps a bad health status, and then you have stronger to count in the diversity of our populations to make policies which are then really adapted and really tailored to the people we talk about. And this refers also to questions in the room. This requires us also to get a broader sample of data. So we are currently exploring what kind of data we can also gain from business side, or what can you gain data from geospatial information? What can you gain data from social media information, so that we get a more complete picture and more nuanced and differentiated picture to tailor our policies to certain groups which are vulnerable and particularly in need of help. This refers also to the question on the retirement system. So there may be people who can work longer and can benefit from flexible working arrangements, and people who can't. And there may be people who need are falling into poverty, which need perhaps more support when they age, and people who don't. So we have to think more about these matters of diversity. Here was also a question raised on migration, so this also has to be counted in. So this makes the picture even more complicated, and this is now also an offer to Deša and the policymakers. Demographers are actually ready to unlock this kind of complexity, to describe diversity, to create groups which we can look into, to help you see which population groups we need to focus most on in our policies and our societal care, because they are the most vulnerable ones. So I think this cooperation between science and politics is extremely essential in that regard, and demographers since 1662 are ready to do so.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for adding up on this. For the next round of questions, so the first person I have is Zoom Benutzer, who is raising his or her hand. Please let us know who you are, and then please feel free to ask a question, unless it's an accidental raising of the hand. Okay, if that might be the case, so maybe let's start then with the questions that we already have in the chat. There is one question by Colette. She asks, how does migration and migration management policies impact the demography and future generations program planning? And let's put this together with a question by Christa Möller, who implicitly asks or raises the point of ageism. So there's ageism, the elderly are often not taken into account, are sorted out, marginalized. We need lifelong learning and much more health prevention. Would you agree, the three of you, with this, or what is your opinion on the impact of ageism and attitudes between the generations? Katharina, you unmuted yourself.
Yes. So if I may start again. I think ageism, of course, is an issue, and I think we as a society should be very clear that aging is not a matter of not being productive anymore. This is for sure. I mean, there is no doubt about that we have extremely productive elderlies. But on the other hand, I would also emphasize that elderly already do a lot for the society, and we might even more pronounce that and have a better focus on that. For instance, even in between the family, concerning, I always come back to childhood issues, concerning grandparental care. It's extremely important. We have an increasing daycare market in Germany, but on the other hand, we have research showing that the grandparents who help and support families is not affected at all by an increasing formal childcare market. So the family, this intergenerational link is still effective and still working. This is one side. The other side, outside the interior family, I think it's very important that we have lifelong learning initiatives for sure, that we have different kind, even volunteer programs, where I think the generations can really benefit from each other. And I think there is absolutely, I totally agree, more scope for this type of support between the generations. And this has to do with ageism, but on the other hand, it also has to do with offering your kind of work you can, and on the other hand, accepting it. And I think childcare is a very good issue where it works.
Deša, please, if you wanted to add on this.
Yeah, so what we have tried to do in the Commission is this switch from aging to longevity. And I know it's not only just about the wording, it's really the change of the mindset. So by switching from aging to longevity, we don't speak anymore only about, this kind of long-term care and frailty linked to old age. We actually speak about a completely new generation of seniors that are productive, that are contributing to the society, that are seen in a very different manner. So the idea with the demography toolbox that was presented by the Commission, now almost 2 years ago, was really to switch from this aging narrative into a longevity society, longevity economy, whereby we really capitalize on this longevity dividend, and we include this new type of literacy, which is a longevity literacy, and which completely changes also this. Everybody thinks about, pensions in there, but when you look into education, for example, the way we function today is that we front load education to the first 20 years, then you capitalize during your working life, and then you retire. But if we live much longer, this type of functioning is not possible anymore, and the whole idea of lifelong learning becomes completely mandatory and not optional. And when I just wanted to link it a little bit to migration, because I was speaking about this activation of the entirety of the human capital, and the demography toolbox is very clear when it comes to these pillars of the human capital we have in Europe. And the pillars that we have divided in there are, first of all, the parents, and why we have divided them as a specific category is because of this women dimension. Is we really want to make sure that the women are able to participate and are able to be on the labor market. Then we have the youth dimension, because we need to make sure that their skills are indeed matching the needs of the labor market and the needs of the transitions that Europe is going through. Then we have the pillar of elderly, whereby we introduce this element of longevity. But the fourth pillar of the demography toolbox are the migrants. And we speak there about legal migration and about managed migration. So this is the migration we're talking about. And it's we don't really have time to enter in there, but there is this whole dimension of cross-fertilization, as well, because the idea is not just to drain talents from third countries. The idea is really to empower them as well, and not just to replicate the brain drain we have internally in Europe. But just to say that, be it older people, the seniors, or the migrants, they are all part of this human capital that we really need to make sure that we continue to be competitive globally speaking.
Thank you very much, Deša, and thank you very much to everyone for this very insightful discussion. We're slowly approaching the end of time. I would quickly like to return to the fact that it's a birthday, and I mean, I don't know if there are many gifts to give away today, but at least we could wish for something. So first of all, everyone in the audience, please let us know in the chat if there is one thing that you could wish for on the occasion of the Day of Demography. What would that be? And the question goes to the three panelists as well. In maximum 30 seconds, what would that be that you would be wishing for? Andreas.
What I would be wishing for is don't fear. To be like John Graunt, just look at the data, make your analysis, make your outcomes, and then help at creating better policies. Be modest, be open to other ideas, and to get influx from other ideas. And I think that's the best way to go, also to go over ageism and other bad movements.
Thank you so much. Katharina.
To add something from John Graunt, I would say have a long-term perspective on issues. Don't just think in the short term, think in a more broader, longer perspective. And I think some problems then are not as severe as we might think.
Thank you. And Deša?
Well, I think for me, it's just to make demography fully actionable, to make sure that the data we have, we actually use them to anticipate the impact, the demographic change is going to have on our policies, and to make sure that we take the time to do it. And because, as we said in the beginning, demography is always important, but it's somehow never urgent. And then it's overtaken by other crises. But at the end, we realize how much is underpinning basically all our policies and is a factor of success of all our proposals.
Thank you very much. There's so many good ideas on how we can proceed here. For now, what leaves is what is left for us is to carry on celebrating Demography Day for the rest of the day, and also in the coming years on February 4th. If you are intrigued with the topic and you want to learn more about John Graunt and the birthday of demography, Andreas Edel's book in German, Der Mann hinter den Zahlen, has, as I said, recently been published. It's also as an ebook, open access, so for free accessible. And he also came to talk about it, as Katharina mentioned in my podcast, Alter, was geht, in the most recent episode, Man muss fest mit der Pest rechnen. Also make sure to follow the BID, the Federal Institute for Population Research, and obviously the European Commission. I mean, you can't really not follow the European Commission in your everyday life, I think. But if you want to be informed on what they're planning, please feel free to follow them. And thank you so much for joining, and enjoy the rest of the European Day of Demography.